Let's quickly review our Saffin's Bridge before we go any farther. We start with a focus on the Bible. We start with their world. That was then, this is now. We move to focus on our needs today. We end our preparation to preach with our world. State it is the stage where we establish what the text meant to them in their world. Aim it and frame it are the stages where we refocus the sermon on what the text means to us in our world. Then we come to nail it. Nail it is the stage of sermon preparation where we are going to apply the text to our lives. We will focus in this session on identifying the CLPs for your sermon. Traditionally, of course, we call this application. Unfortunately, preachers can end up teaching more error in their application than in any other part of the message. Liberal commentators, for example, can exegete the text accurately, yet twist the truth of the text applicationally. Evangelical preachers often slip into illegitimate applications that end up obscuring the truth of the text to say what they want it to say instead of what it actually says. Take, for example, Matthew 18, verses 19 to 20. Jesus said these words, very famous, very familiar. If two of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. I often hear preachers apply this text to prayer. It's such a handy verse to reassure people that Jesus is with them when just a few gather together for prayer. However, the verse in its context is not about prayer at all. The context of the verse is church discipline. These two verses are the culmination of a unit of thought that began with the words, "If your brother sins, go and show his fault in private." The disciplinary or correction sequence moves from one-on-one in private to 2 or 3 confronting the sinner. If the sinner refuses to listen to them, then they are to take it to the church, the assembly. If the sinner refuses to listen to the church, then Jesus says, "Let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." Jesus then states that whatever the church binds on earth, it shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever the church looses on earth, it shall have been loosed in heaven. The authority of heaven is behind the decision of the church in discipline. The cultural background clearly refers to the rules of the Jewish synagogue or assembly. The binding and the loosing were rabbinic terms for the disciplinary decisions of the assembly. To bind something was to forbid it, and to loose something was to allow it. The next verses speak of 2 or 3 who agree on earth. These were the witnesses to a judicial decision. The Jewish court of law required 2 or 3 witnesses to convict or acquit someone. So this is not a verse about prayer at all. Jesus is saying that he is in their midst as a church when they have to make a disciplinary decision on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses who agree on the details. So here is a good example of illegitimate application when, even as evangelicals, orthodox in our theology, we apply the text to prayer. We must nail our CLPs, our contemporary life parallels, to good exegesis of the text, and then look for the parallels to our lives today. let's examine how this process works in sermon preparation. John Stott was speaking with two brothers some years ago who had grown up in a strong Christian home. One brother was a student at Oxford University and the other at Edinburgh. Both had totally rejected the Christian faith. One was an atheist, the other was an agnostic. And he asked them what had happened. Was it that they no longer believed Christianity was true? And they both said no, that wasn't the issue at all. In fact, they said, even if someone were to prove to them that Christianity was true, it wouldn't matter. What we want to know, they said, is not whether Christianity is true, but whether it's relevant. Christianity was an ancient religion. The Bible was an ancient document. They could not see how such ancient teachings could have any relevance to the modern world. Every preacher faces the challenge of two worlds, the world of the Bible and the world of today. Preachers tackle the problem of relevancy in two ways. Some preach as if all that matters is the world of the Bible. They are biblical, but not contemporary. They believe so much in the sufficiency of Scripture that they stress information without application. But the sermons become irrelevant to modern minds. Others preach as if all that matters is the world of today. They are contemporary, but not biblical. They have surrendered to the skeptics who claim that the Bible is irrelevant to modern minds. Either way, the Bible is seen as irrelevant by the people we talk to today. Application without exegesis is like a bowl of plastic fruit. It looks pretty but doesn't satisfy. Exegesis without application is like a freeze-dried dinner. It's nutritious but tastes awful, and most people don't want to eat it regularly. How do we connect the application to the exegesis in a way that communicates a relevant message to our listeners today? Missiologists call it the process of contextualization, connecting one culture with another culture. There are two sides to contextualization: the world of the speaker and the world of the receiver. And both worlds must be embraced if true communication is to take place. The world of the Bible tells us what the text meant. The world of our audience informs what the text means. We must never divorce what it means to us from what it meant to them. How do we contextualize the sermon? We start with what it meant in the context of the biblical world. We look at the original situation. We determine the historical meaning, what the author was trying to say. Then we develop a universal principle from the original meaning. We principalize the Scripture. A universal truth is something that is true in every age and in every culture. These universals form the bridge, the connecting point between what it meant and what it means. The universal principle leads to a current application. Once we have a universal principle, we can look for contemporary life parallels between the historical meaning and the current application. And once we have identified a CLP for our text, we can zoom in to apply the text to a specific situation. Brian Chappell calls it situational specificity. We don't want the application to dribble away into generalities because it will lose its punch. We want to be able to apply the text to specific situations people face today in their lives. This makes the universal principle have situational specificity. Situational specificity requires that we remember the difference between interpretation and application. Interpretation is one. Applications are many. Applications can go in many directions depending upon the audience. And that's why our sermons can be framed in different ways. But there can only be one correct interpretation. There are only two parameters to guide our application. One, the content of the biblical passage. And two, the needs of the people in our audience. As has been said, the purpose of preaching is to answer on Sunday what your people are asking on Thursday. Many times, people have said to me after a sermon, "Pastor, were you in our house this week? Because it sounded like you heard what we were talking about. That sermon was just for me." Well, I had no idea, of course, but God did. As Sangster said, searching preaching is either divinely inspired or intolerably insolent. We need to get from what it meant to what it means. How do we do that? We use a tool I call a CLP. So let's talk about developing your CLPs. A CLP is a contemporary life parallel. As preachers, our job is to connect the biblical historical event or situation with the current parallel event or situation that our audience faces. We are looking for a parallel between the two. The goal is to help them see that the Bible is relevant to what they face today. We want to show people that truth rises out of Scripture and that the truth addresses their real needs today. So there are two steps to developing an effective and accurate CLP. We nail it to the text and we nail it to the people. Here's a novel idea in today's culture. Relevance comes from the text of Scripture. Preachers today tend to think that relevance comes from our modern world. You have to be in tune with the issues, styles, and feelings of people in the world today to be relevant. We need to talk like them and think like them to reach them. Well, I want to tell you that relevance starts with the text, not the world. There is a place, of course, and we'll talk about that, for understanding our world today in the process of application. But we must not start there, or we will end up being superficial at best in our preaching. God knows us better than we know ourselves. God created this world. God wrote His Word. We start with the presupposition that if God made us and God wrote the Bible, God knows best what we need. So we find our relevance in the text. Effective application ties the application to the text. People need to see that the application comes out of the Bible and not out of the preacher's head, if they are going to trust God for the solutions to their deepest needs. Nail the application to the text first. Every text then functions on two levels, and understanding these two levels helps us develop an accurate CLP. There is the setting of the events and the people themselves, and the setting of the readers and listeners to whom the book was addressed. Those are the two levels. Let's talk about the setting of the events. As Bible students, you are familiar with the setting of the original event in the upper room, the night before the crucifixion. The setting of the text deals with these historic details. What is happening as Jesus speaks? What is the meal that they are taking? Where are that they are eating? Where are they when all this happens? What is about to happen that night in the garden and the next day in the crucifixion? These are fundamental basic details. But we need to dig deeper to find our baseline for the CLP. John wrote his gospel in Greek, but Jesus probably spoke mostly in Aramaic. And there are many biblical, cultural, and historical allusions in the text because Jesus, like all Jews, was steeped in the Old Testament scriptures and in their own historical, cultural background in Judaism. So we want to learn all we can about the Old Testament background or the cultural background in which Jesus lived and functioned and spoke so that we can understand what is being said. The words and their meanings are important and should be informed by the likely Aramaic background of the teaching. Your assignment for this segment will focus on John 15, verses 1 through 8. What is the emotional tone of the text in John 15, verses 1 through 8? This is the familiar passage on the vine and the branches. Are there emotional words that have connotations beyond the denotative, that's the dictionary meaning of the word? Because connotative meaning is powerful. Are there words in the text that have connotation that is emotionally powerful? Did Jesus use figures of speech? Obviously, vine and branches. Did he use literary devices as he taught? What are they? And how do they inform our understanding? How about the disciples? What were they thinking and feeling as Jesus talked that last night? Especially when he was talking about being fruitful in the vine and the branches in this assignment. If Jesus and his disciples left the upper room in John 14, verse 31, then they were likely in the temple area as Jesus taught about the vine and the branches. How would that change your CLP? Every text functions on two levels. There's the level of the events that John describes and the level of the readers to whom John is writing. We will address the context of the readers in the next video, but your assignment for this session will focus on the context of the events as they took place that night, and the disciples who were there and what they were dealing with. The passage you will be studying in this assignment is John 15, 1 through 8, and you'll need to answer these questions. How do the literary devices in these verses influence your application? 2, what is the Old Testament background for the vine and the branches? 3, what do you learn from the horticultural practices of vine dressers in Jesus' day? 4, what do the words takes away and prunes mean in John 15, 2? And 5, how does that background shape your CLP for your sermon?